Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Tuesday Train with the 2MK group. Today we are having our usual Guilty Gear lobby. This is an East Coast PS4 lobby. It does have an ID and a password which you can find either on our Twitter or if you happen to be watching the stream, obviously, in the title. Feel free to join up and get some practice if you live either on the US East Coast or toward the northern part of Europe. The distance that we use generally will allow you to play even if it won't always be as clean as some might like it. This week, of course, we're taking advantage of the standard things that our group does. Making sure that everyone gets as much experience with the various characters that we play as possible. I'll be on the mic. Apparently this week I do not sound like a robot. Discussing beginner to intermediate level matchup stuff. Since it is loser stays on, you can get as much matchup practice as possible without ever having to worry about needing to be able to beat a particular character in order to stay on the system. Though generally we suggest that if you do have trouble keeping up, you give yourself a break every now and again and more so observe than play. See if you can pick up anything from watching others fight. This week, once again, we'll mostly be looking at ways for Answer to move around the screen. And in some cases, depending on who joins, the counters that the people can use to Answer's position. The Business Ninja has a lot of ways to move around other people's things, but he does take a certain amount of time to achieve this, so there's a lot of pre-planning involved. Similar to Jack-O and to some extent Venom and Johnny, you have to have a fairly good idea of where your opponent wants to be, which may differ by player, but usually just differs by character. In Kai's case, for example, Answer generally wants to have perches over Kai's head. While Kai does have counters to this, most of them don't do a lot of damage, so Answer's job from there is mostly to control space and use his not quite superior but effectively equal longer normals to keep up with Kai in general. Kai benefits most from therefore being relatively daring about the things he does. Since once he gets a knockdown, Answer takes a lot of time to get set back up, and Kai can press his advantage pretty hard. Both characters are fairly comfortable far away from each other, and at that range it's a lot of trying to outthink the other player in terms of the speed with which you set up certain things or go for certain moves. This is not to say that Answer does not have tools for when he's in this situation. But his tools in this situation are relatively limited and easily baited. If he absolutely believes that Kai is going to launch an attack, he does have a counter that can move him entirely out of the way. In this matchup, Answer does not generally need a lot of meter. And therefore gets to use it for big confirms, covering space for himself, or, and this is the most likely thing he will do with the large amounts of meter since he does not build it up quickly, using the green block faultless defense to keep Kai at a range where Answer can actually recover enough. Fighting Sin is very similar in terms of how the meter is used, but not so much in the placement of stuff. Sin has even longer normals and a general similarity to Axel in the sense that there's not much you can do with just having the high purchase set. Low ones, on the other hand, force Sin to respond to a lot more things on the ground, and help out with the mobility that Answer is able to put forward. Unfortunately, it's not enough by itself since Answer's actual attack capacity is quite a bit lower when faced with a character he cannot move forward against. He has to spend a lot more time chipping away at Sin very slowly, and being patient at the fact that as long as Sin's normals are, they generally don't cross things as quickly as Kai's do. Understanding the rhythm of defense for Answer in this matchup is relatively difficult, but probably one of the most important parts. However, since Sin is very, very unable to attack in this matchup as a strictly normal thing, Answer has a lot more freedom of movement than against Kai. While Sin's attacks are not necessarily risky until he runs out of calorie gauge, Answer is one of the characters in the game that is most able to clip him while he's trying to recharge it. Without putting himself at basically any risk. The match therefore turns out to be relatively hard work for both players if they decide to play it neutral. Sin's generally slower style of move and long pushback, however, mean that unlike Kai, he does not really get as much pressure off of his knockdowns. As you can see, with just basic green blocking applied, Answer can shift the situation very much in his favor relative to where he's standing versus Kai. It's not strictly hard for Kai to open Answer up, but he does have to manage to get closer than most characters do, and closer than Kai is normally used to doing, in order to achieve it. Generally, in order to be most successful in this matchup, the Answer player must use one final piece. The fact that Kai's moves tend to take extremely long to reach Answer means that they can use his parry counter style technique to save themselves a lot of trouble in neutral. This allows them to over time confound Kai's basic approaches in terms of attacks and force the Kai player to rely almost entirely on very, very good defense and reactions to tracking Answer's position and countering with either invincible moves or moves that put Kai out of the space the Answer is attacking at, followed by probably pressure, because it's not often easy to get more than pressure in that situation. Against Sin, this is much less necessary. Answer has a much clearer idea of where he is relative to Sin's attacks when they are being done, and while they are a bit faster than Kai's in the strict sense, he could still use it. The difference being that with Kai, generally shifting the position using that parry counter will lead to a lot of damage, whereas against Sin it will not lead to as much. Sin also tends to mostly use his specials when the situation is very clear, and therefore it's much easier for the Sin player to make the adjustment to simply not use those attacks in very neutral situations, knowing the Answer will probably just dodge out of it. Finally, his ability to delay or shift the timing of those attacks means that Answer cannot necessarily respond to the startup of them, and generally does not have any great benefit to doing the things in exactly this way. He can make much better use of the fact that Sin really has very few ways to cross the screen quickly in ways the Answer cannot deal with. And his attack vectors tend to be more so in front of him than Kai. He does not have a lot of moves to immediately go upward with or attack over his own head. He has such moves, but they are slow enough the Answer can usually evade them. Sin therefore must think about whether or not he wants to be on the ground in the first place. Since his air normals and some of his specials are much more useful against Answer than they are against most of the cast. Being on the ground is not too useful because not only does Answer tend to attack toward the ground space, when he does not, he usually has to be much closer. Sin can therefore gain a lot of advantage by shifting his normal movements so that he's in the air more often. And build his defensive play from there. Answer's moves tend to move Answer quite a lot forward if he's going to commit to anything at all. And Sin has a lot of very quick counterattacks that do not even work all that well when someone like Answer pushes himself out with a longer block string. In contrast, the father-son matchup is a lot easier to understand. They both have a lot of moves that cover the other's approaches and attack vectors, and have enough range to keep the other at full speed, still spacing when on defense. A large part of this match has more to do with pressure strings and the chosen pressure strings, as well as run up and throw and similar things. It's a very spacing heavy match. Whichever player is more prepared tends to be able to stop the other's moves quite well. And while evasion is a factor, the moves that they actually end up evading are relatively clear. The result is that generally, unorthodox thinking and some trickiness can be required at this level of play. Sin, for example, benefits quite a lot from both his vault leap, as you've seen there, because he can in fact vary how far that goes, and it can be easily mistaken for some other things he does. He also benefits from just throwing out random buttons in neutral to cover the twitch and make Kai respond to things that aren't real. Just basic button loops in neutral from either side can often lead to the other committing to a very big counterattack, which is then completely lost. But as you can see, there's a lot of specials being blocked. and a lot of moments at which the player sees an opportunity to do a running up attack because the other's mindset is in the defensive state. And despite having relatively quick buttons, Sin's throws are very fast and tend to catch buttons in the early startup of them if you time it right. With these two particular characters, running up and throwing your opponent is a valid strategy for many situations. Which purchase answer should actually place has a lot more to do with the style of the Sin player than the character itself. Against the standard player, the optimal way of doing this is to put the closer one high and the further one low. The reason for this is, when answer takes into the air, it avoids a large number of Sin's attacks. The attacks it does not avoid are the type that Sin cannot afford to just randomly do. Once answer has those placed, getting into position to annoy Sin is a lot easier, because if Sin moves away from the position he's in, it's too easy for answer to clip him in some other way. And since you do not have to worry about Sin getting to a new position on screen too easily, it's much easier to just place them and wait. However, against defensive Sin, as you're seeing here, you may be able to benefit from having the one in front of him be the lower one. The requirement of this, however, is much heavier on answer's execution. It is much easier for answer to stay in one position, throw cards, and wait for Sin to make a mistake than it is to take the other option. Specifically, to throw the card and then walk forward slightly or dash forward slightly every time. Against Sin, this works because answer can buy time in this way. If answer is throwing cards, Sin is less likely to want to be hitting buttons or anything that would specifically counter answer's dashes. So finding the right moment to take that opportunity and dash forward can be really powerful. And if you recognize that you really needed to take to the air, a long jump from there would allow you to get to the one that you had placed above Sin's head. Whereas if you do get knocked back, from certain positions at least, you will land on the perch that is in front and still be fine. As you can see there, answer almost made it to the perch on that space and could have probably done something to get closer to Sin in that position. Basically, this enhances the capacity for footsies between the two characters by placing Sin on the defensive but opening up answer's capacity to move around. This tends not to work as much on preemptive Sin players or mobile ones, because obviously their aim is to reach answer or to strike him from very far away, leaving no real option in terms of when to dash forward. They'll just basically block the whole thing, or vault out of the way, which is the one thing that will, in fact, usually get Sin past answer's cards. By putting the purchase overhead, answer is able to force Kai to play in such a way that Kai could be anti-aired or subjected to certain types of attack. He must then play the footsie game similar to how he must play it against Ino or Johnny, making it more comfortable for answer in general. Kai in turn reacts by putting up the air grinder, but as you can see, the damage gained from this is not that great. Plus, mistiming it leads to basically nothing, since answer can stay on those perches for quite a while. He does not have to go to them. Kai is constantly, therefore, pushed to reposition himself to get things into the right situation, so the answer cannot in fact use those against him. You can further see demonstrated here that once Kai is forced to respond to perches every time they're placed, answer can easily spend more time putting down more and getting more options. Kai is not very good at reaching him in ways that are really obvious from the distance that this normally happens. One of Answer's best options, therefore, is sometimes to just go up to his perch and stay there. Depending on where Kai went on the screen, there's very little he can do that won't be easily intercepted by something else. It is just as easy, if not easier, for Answer to react while perched than anything else. And that speed of movement can cause Kai a large amount of grief. The easiest solution for Kai is to simply block as soon as Answer gets into that position and stay there. However, Answer does have a lot of relatively strange options from his perches. Which are more likely to cause Kai to actually want to respond in some way. Whiffing certain moves in front of Kai into throw can open therefore up a lot of damage. A defensive scene player has basically very few options against the tactic of the further perch above and the closer one in front. This is because he cannot afford to basically stick out buttons, simply because Answer will do too many things. His aim, therefore, is actually to, again, stay in the air with small hops or vaults to change the range so that he can do more attacks. However, defensive seems to have a lot less reason to do this as an offense tool, and should generally just try to do this when the opportunity shows itself, normally with a little clip or something, just to get into a new position. Fortunately, Sin does have that which is a good attack to fill that space. He can also use his very long swing to get to it, which I believe is his stand heavy. However, he must note that this will definitely still result in him taking card damage. And there's no real way around that. Sin is generally looking for that moment where Answer has done anything other than throw cards to move forward, and any moment where he's throwing too many cards to try to vault out. Without the aim of actually reaching Answer, especially if he's very far away. If you happen to reach him, good, but generally that's not the aim. Simply taking advantage of the fact that Sin has such good reach, and Answer's cards really don't do that much damage. They're more so good at frustrating you into staying still and giving Answer movement options. If your defense then becomes mobility, you're not really paying attention to Answer's movement options in the first place. And eventually, things will work out in your favor, either because of the range on Beat Driver, or because Answer's air normals, while very good on offense, are not particularly good on air defense. Kai's attack vectors for that space the Answer is able to occupy are not entirely lacking. And his movement does lead to a lot of good defensive positions for him. Taking this perspective generally means the Answer is relatively unable to play neutral. But Kai also cannot simply stay in his position. And it is that moment where he has to reposition himself in order to get the hit he wants that leaves Answer with the opening to do damage. Fortunately, as one gets more and more used to it, Answer's attacks from his perches become more and more reactable, especially someone who is using a character like Kai who has invincible moves and very quick pokes. Making it even more and more important for Answer to stay on perches without making attacks, to lure Kai into attempting repositions, which are then punished by the speed of Answer's reactive moves. Just like with Ino, one is generally looking to force Kai to feel like he needs to reposition. And once one has done this, then you get your ants, your attack vectors. As you can see here, without perches, there's really not much that happens. When Answer is positioned correctly on offense, it basically forces Kai to retreat. He can't be certain of any given thing, and his best options shift a lot. therefore meaning that even though Answer's attacks are heavily reactable, just the jitteriness alone could cause problems. Against Footsie's style Kai, the flow for Answer doesn't need to change too much and becomes relatively easier in fact. Footsie's Kai is the character that is able to make Answer use up most if not all of his meter. Since it opens up Answer's ability to do heavy damage from the air while Kai is attempting to do various things. He's able to take up the space that Kai cannot easily attack, while still having a super that will hit Kai fairly hard and does not really end up being punished. Kai therefore needs to feel a lot more pressure on, but since the green blocking is not as required, it does not come up to Answer to use up his meter on much. He just gets to neutral jump into super a lot of the time and terrible things happen. And of course, as you just seen there, mix it up with the ground one. Since while it lacks the structural invincibility that will allow him to get through a lot of Kai's projectiles, Kai can't afford to throw those projectiles for the same reason. more advanced strategies, Sin is actually quite good at building up the risk meter on other characters. If he is relatively certain that he is in a spacing where he won't be punished, he can build up a lot of the paint meter underneath the health. This causes the opponent to take more damage when they eventually do get hit. The problem with it is that this is not a really sustainable strategy for him, because most of the reasons and ways that he can do this, especially if Kai has any meter available, involve using a massive amount of calorie gauge. While this is therefore effective against a very defensive Kai, one must be sure that said defensive Kai is very committed to the defense and therefore will not specifically attempt to get you while you are trying to eat. The form of Kai you see here is more defense through proactive behaviors, even though not quite footsies. And therefore it is difficult to find times to eat that don't involve actually getting the knockdown. Therefore the risk meter does not come into play very much in this particular matchup between these two players. However, it can be relatively easy to build up the risk meter when one is aware that Kai is pushing too many buttons in neutral. Not specifically by trying to punish those buttons, because Sins generally won't catch them, but simply that Kai knows that he is not in a position to take another action. Therefore being just out of the space for it constantly, but keeping up a threat level so that Kai knows that he cannot immediately do another move, turns the neutral into enough of a mix-up for Sin to continually get random shish kebabs. And despite the fact that Kai will block pretty much everything, it should still work out at the mid-levels until the Kai player is high enough level to start getting out of the way with Kai specials and repositioning on the fly. The unfortunate difference in spacing between answers overhead and his low means that a skilled player who can keep answer at a particular range knows that he basically can't open them up. He has really few good forward moving moves other than his overhead style attacks. And since his lows won't reach, the only thing he can really do at that point is back off. Higher level players will have come up with many other ways of doing this, but none of them that will actually break your guard. So you do not generally need to worry about being opened up. Finding the range that you can put answer at where he can't afford to walk forward differs by character because of the next button you would hit. Jam, for example, has no way to do this because there is simply nothing Jam can hit that will catch answer before he takes a step forward. Kai and Sin, on the other hand, have good buttons for just hitting it just to make sure answer can't progress, and will generally catch him before he can get off the ground as well. Therefore, for them it is relatively easy to put him at a range where he can't open them up, and just occasionally hit a different button. As you can see, unlike a regular fireball where you have to worry about landing on it or something similar, you can defend against Answer's cards relatively easily by taking to the air yourself. And the character is not exactly blessed with a lot of aerial attacks of his own to deal with this. This is partially what makes him more of a lockdown character than a zoner. He has no real strong response to the opponent simply jumping when in card pressure. On the other hand, they don't really get to launch any attacks on him either, so he does get to lock them down and keep himself safe while doing it. Fortunately for Answer, once in the air along with an opponent, doing the air version of his super is usually effective. He might not get full damage, but he will get the knockdown and a good setup after it. As you can see demonstrated there, Kai had all of the advantage in that situation. There is nothing Answer can do to reach that will not either lose to an invincible move or whiff entirely. The final part of this matchup, therefore, is about the Sin player learning exactly how far Beat Driver reaches and what moves it will often whiff punish. Answer is relatively susceptible to this move when the Sin is at a very specific spot on the screen. Because despite it looking very much like a generally slower strike, Beat Driver is actually extremely fast. And once Answer has been clipped by that move, he has very few options. He has not been knocked down, he's not been pushed off his feet, and he can't actually do any moves on wake up. As long as Sin has enough calorie gauge, Sin will be the one at full advantage. This is not as true when the Beat Driver hits closer, but at extreme long range, there's not much that Answer can do because Answer relies on getting so perfectly spaced for his cards and perches. Sin can, on the other hand, take a step into his optimal position or any number of other small things because he has a lot of moves that can reposition him while attacking. Least of all, that. Since Answer loses his lockdown at that point and can no longer throw cards to prevent Beat Driver or simply jump out of it, it approximates to standard zoning in other games. Against Slayer, Answer doesn't care which specific of two purge options he uses as long as there's one above his own head for the most part. Slayer does have attack vectors that reach that space, but they're not usually as good. And they tend to leave him relatively open. whereas he has a lot of moves that quickly get him through Answer's card lockdown, and similar things. This match therefore becomes mostly about Answer's motion and anti-airs, and understanding how long to stay on the perch to force Slayer to either reposition or get confused by things. Slayer loses a lot of his capacity to attack when Answer varies the amount of time he stays on a perch. Reactive counterattacking no longer works at all, and without reactive counterattacks, Slayer can have a lot of trouble. Slayer does benefit from pressure, but unfortunately for him, in this matchup, pressuring Answer is not usually a good solution in itself. This is because Answer's ability to get out of it through the same method as Kai, just green block nearly everything Slayer does, leaves him at a huge disadvantage in the long term. Answer's ability to get over a predicted low from Slayer is just as bad. However, at a particular range, Answer is at a heavy disadvantage because he cannot move safely. Slayer's buttons all reach quite well, and Answer cannot get away from any of them. His backdash, while it is quite good, and will save him from a ton of things, also tends to put him at a range where he doesn't want to be himself. He has no direct strong option there, other than to attempt to backdash and then long jump back in, rather than worrying about a bunch of Slayer stuff. Overall, though, it is relatively pointless for Answer to try to beat Slayer in normal neutral without backdashing. Any insistence on doing this will result in Slayer basically being able to just push buttons until he wins. When in this position as answer, your best bet is once again Fat Dash. He has no direct ways past it that don't involve finding the right moment for his own attack. And without defending it, there's very little chance that Sin will actually run out of calorie gauge, because every time he manages to land one hit, he'll just recharge. One must therefore be patient enough until you can get the lockdown started. And before that, well, blocking is a thing. If your general wish is to play answer by pressing a lot of buttons, you have to make sure that you're much better at staying very close to opponents. As usual, the relative secret to playing shinobi characters is patience. With enough patience, Answer can bait basically anyone into basically anything. or take very little damage while he's setting this up. The challenge is the sheer amount of tracking of various things you must do in order to succeed at it. The opponent must therefore also try to win a battle of patience, or at least of hit confirms. Patience is useful in this sort of match because it prevents you from becoming predictable enough for your opponent to continually respond to your trickery. Their option then becoming going on the offense themselves, but once you've learned their rhythm for that, it's a lot easier to keep that in mind and push them back. As you can see, Answer can basically reset the spacing on nearly any opponent, at his leisure, once he has enough meter. Fortunately for balance, when Answer is playing in this patient defensive way, he does not tend to build up a lot of meter because he cannot spend a lot of time dashing. Slayer is another one character where Answer must watch to the opponent's responses to him placing perches, more so than he has to do it the other way. In many other matches, Answer's aim is to get onto the perch as soon as possible, and watch to see what the opponent does once he's there. In the match against Slayer, generally Answer's job is to place the perch and see how Slayer responds to him placing it, rather than trying to get into it. This is again because Slayer's attack vectors don't generally go through Answer's defenses that easily. Leaving Answer with a lot of freedom to move around and to rethink his game plan. But not a lot of freedom to move very quickly around the place and keep up a mental pressure, a mental stack on Slayer, because Slayer is not really susceptible to mental stack problems. He can basically just press long buttons and get out of a lot of things. What he cannot do is get in. Therefore, waiting for Answer to eventually make a mistake by attacking too much is probably the better option. From Answer's side, the benefit to this is that Answer gets to basically freely build up meter and Slayer does not. But as you can know, as long as Answer tries to deal with Slayer by taking actions, Slayer will win. Defense is very important on Answer's side in this matchup. Having a group to practice with can give you this specific opportunity to train exactly what you feel like training, or to vary the ways that you need to think as much as possible to improve your mental flexibility at tournaments. Having to switch from fighting Slayer, who basically is a matter of Answer needing to be patient to defend his way out of certain things, and only really respond to one, to Sin, who is basically the opposite. You defend against one thing and attack through everything else, can help you improve your flexibility over time, even if it does result in a lot of losing as you get used to it. As one improves and you see more and more spacing shifts, the complexity of the match increases. But it's from this basis that you understand the matchup event well enough to get to the high-level play. When the high-level play occurs, it's usually missing almost all of the previous components, simply because the players will have adapted around a lot of the other one's options, or learn to react to a lot of these things.
はい、現代社会において国の礎は知識と教養です。教育法規も国の保障として厳密に定めていく方向でまとめております。はは、いや何、言うことを聞かない小僧は全力でかかってこい。進化した俺の極来見てくれよな。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっが重要だぞ。はい、勝ちだ。デュエル2、全部出し切れよな。それで勝ちだ。うまいぞ。 を精錬することだ。はい、勝ちだ。ストレート。基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっともその潜在能力に訓練された技術が備わってもう私ではかなわないかもしれない。スレイヤーバーサス俺さあ楽しもうぜ。
Get up to rock! Get up to burn!
恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっおいおいおいちょっとおいおい見えねえ。反則と
この一服より時間がかからんとはね。
スレイヤー勝ちだ。デュエル2よし
これらのマンネリカムチェコンゴとマンネリだよ。
おいちょっと反則と
当たり前
反則と
当たり前よ。はしたなようだがオードブルでは満足できなくてね。
スレイヤー勝ちだ。ストレート。
はいん、それは君の若さだ。ああ、知りたいと。よろしい。新指導を学ぶのに年は不問だ。まず
アンサーバーサス俺さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっちまえ。僕たちはお久しぶりです。お分かりになりませんか。アンサーです。そう、そのアンサーです。お元気そうになるようにです。おいおいおい、この家だぜ。おやりません。好きにだもん。おいおい、そうですね。好きにそうです。反則だった。ご挨拶に伺わせていただきます。どうぞ。どうもアンサーです。はい。先日ご挨拶にお伺 せん。私どもは現在そちら方面にいと早速取り掛かりたいと思います。それではお世話になっておりますアンサーです。はい、今朝は暑い日が続きますね。5分で済む話ですカイさん。失礼。こう見えて私も忙しい。いいえ、ちょうど暇を持て余していたところです。はい、現代社会において国の礎
One of Sin's great strengths against Kai is that Kai's attacks normally suffer relatively heavily on approach versus Sin's standing dust. Mixing this up with the crouching is just as bad. There's really very few things that Kai can do once he has momentum that will allow him to not only block that, but also hit Sin from doing much. The range of the move is actually much more than expected for most things. Fortunately for Kai, Sin gets basically no follow-ups off this move, whether it's blocked or hits, leaving him able to do a lot of things and keep his own pressure up while building a lot more meter than Sin is usually building. Sin is therefore forced to actually do the dust follow-ups, which don't necessarily leave him at good positions unless he has quite enough calorie gauge to finish him out. But since they cover so many of Kai's approaches, and the fact that the second hit of Sin's stand heavy is in fact a low, it makes basically running at him from full screen to solve your problem kind of a bad idea. You get caught in a defensive mix-up just for trying to approach him, forcing you to use a lot of that same meter for what you just saw, YRC after Sparks. Sin has very few responses to that in turn. So the match can turn into basically a game of chicken, whichever player is more willing to pull out that move in neutral first. However, both of them are capable of using slide to make the relative read on their opponent's effort when they do this. So in Sin's case, it more so becomes a three-way defensive mix-up. And Kai, it's really hard to call it a mix-up in that regard, since he's not really responding to anything Sin is specifically doing. But he's also not able to do it at the same range, so it's not really ambiguous. Kai must therefore rely on a lot of his moves that hit from much further away than usual. While Sin cannot necessarily respond to those with anything in particular, they are much easier to defend.
Get up to rock! Get up to burn! Stand with the fire! Duel!
早速取り掛かりたいと思います。それでご無沙汰しておりますアンサーです。その説はお世話になりました。近くまで来ましたのでご挨拶をと思いまして。そうですか。いけますね。マジくらえだろ。完全ですか。もろ見えてちょっとやべえぞ。明後日楽しみにしております。どうもアンサーです。本日はお忙しいところ貴重なお時間をいただきありがとうございます。早速な話題で恐縮ですが、例の件に関してですね。やべやったー。反則とさすがに止められませんね。あなたの技は全て完全に見切ってはい、チェックボールですか。すいませんでした。勝ちだストレート。はい、現代社会において国の礎は知識と教養です。教育法規も国の保障として厳密に定めていく方向でまとめております。いや恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやったさあ防ぎたまさあいかんか正直もう少しできると思ったんだがね。スレイヤー勝ちだ。デュエル2 3出す気だよな。この間ねいかねかな。はい、それは君の恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやったいかないかな。いかないかな。いかないかな。
と思ったんだがね。
As a character, Slayer has both the strength and the weakness that he never really has to stop attacking. It's up to the other player to work out exactly which defensive option they have that will actually push him out of their position. Normally once he's cornered you, either your burst or your green block are basically your only options. If you can force the Slayer player to become patient and therefore use that option to hit them, you might be able to get them first. But beyond that, you really have very few options. He does not need to stop his strings, and very few characters have any buttons that will beat them. If you have invincible moves, these are usually useful though. Depending on the execution required for these moves, however, you may not be able to pull them off in time, and Slayer may simply bait them. While he's not functionally a rushdown character, he is allowed to have these level of block strings so that he can push himself back to the position in neutral that he prefers. This makes it effectively impossible to actually mount a defense against Slayer that does not revolve around managing resources or invincible moves. This is compounded by the fact that he's relatively strong in neutral as well, so unless you have a fairly good idea of exactly what you're doing, he tends to dominate you if you try to play defensively. Generally, this requires, therefore, that you must be ready to faultless defense Slayer from the beginning of his strings, so as to get an advantage. He's a good character to learn it against because Slayer will eventually force you to learn to combine the concept of regular blocking and green blocking very early into it, and every time you get it wrong, he will get in and therefore eat up the rest of your meter for any green block at all, making it impossible to finish out your defense. For Street Fighter fans, Slayer is also relatively similar to Balrog in that if you just neutral jump a lot of his stuff, he loses a lot of potential. This also forces him to spend more time in the air himself and open himself up to anti-airs rather than forcing you to play the ground game with him. But once again, it's a matter of understanding the spacing that you're at and whether or not you have done enough faultless defense to get there. Generally, you can be sure that once you have done the faultless defense from the very beginning of it, you can generally get your punish right afterwards.
Get up to rock! Get up to burn! Stand with the fire! Be your desire!
The rest is a matter of understanding your spacing and Slayer spacing very well. And at what point in the string you actually have to make an action. Slayer also has a large number of moves that leave him close enough to easily be thrown while he is attempting to break your green block. However, after many of these moves, Slayer is not all that free to throw himself. He is within range and could go for it, but would lose a lot of his mix-ups and pressure efforts if he did, making it a fairly good option for when Slayer has managed to stay close to you despite your green block.
端にゴミ捨てちゃダメなんだぜ。ほら、一緒に拾ってやるよ。この名前が書いてある紙。アンサーまずはスレイヤー。さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっちまえ。
やるな。
ゴミ捨てにするアンサーです。そうする。
耐えてみたまえ。あくびが出る。
そうです。そうですね。
感覚ついたがいい授業だったな。
セイヤー勝ちだ。デュエル2。様子見してんだよ。どうもアンサーです。はい、どうも。やめてください。
あくびが出る。
Slayer is also a character against whom it is best to spend some time learning exactly where your opponent tries to do particular things after your block strings. It may be to your benefit to not finish your block strings entirely simply because it will make Slayer's moves interact differently with your own. Slayer has many moves that are more effective when you have pushed him farther away because he moves out of the way before he can be punished by your preemptive move. Or when your preemptive move is in some way limited, giving Slayer relative invincibility against that move. This is particularly seen when one has a relatively long string that is normally ended with a low. Slayer can, unlike most characters, simply press one of his longer lows himself, because at least one of them starts slowly and comes in after your move, and the other evades other lows entirely. Therefore, pushing Slayer as far out as you can with your regular string usually leads to you losing, as he has advantage at that range. Holding him a little closer to you, or simply hitting buttons that are likely to whiff if he doesn't move, while not the better option of the two, can certainly still do something. It's always important as a player to choose exactly which way you want to deal with a situation if there is more than one solution. And there is almost always more than one solution. Just that there's usually only one solution that leads to hitting your opponent and doing more damage. But that might not always be what you want to happen. If the cost of damage is resetting either your mental state or your opponent's, it can be quite a difficult decision to choose if you want to keep on doing that or not. And in games with meters and similar things, you're always running the risk of the opponent simply using that meter to overcome the option that you normally use. So unless it is granting you a great advantage, you might want to hold back on some of those. Or at least on the mindset that you must use them. If you don't feel comfortable and feel as if your style might be doing a little better without it, and you are, at the core, pretty sure that you want to play that specific character that you're playing, there's probably some other benefit somewhere in their design that will allow you to do something else. Characters usually have multiple ways of being played. As designers, one normally puts the character's max capacities all on a board or something, and then in order to make the character fair, you just subtract one or two, depending on how many the game has. Fortunately, this often comes naturally out of whatever style has been chosen for the character, and can be a little disconcerting when their style seems as if it should contain a thing that it does not, and that thing was basically taken from them just for the purposes of making them fair. But there are simple situations such as the fact that Answer basically doesn't have any blatant anti-airs. That is probably a conscious decision on the designer's part. Just take away the anti-airs. He doesn't completely lack them, but he can't, like, snipe you out of the air the way he could snipe you while you're on the ground. Not only would this turn him into a true zoner, but it would be a little bit away from his general style as a character. That said, unless you find that you personally really need that one thing that they're lacking, there's usually at least two options for any given situation. Answer has some better options against the start of Slayer's lows, and a stronger capacity to clip him on the way in of his other moves. Slayer wins against Answer primarily by dashing. This leads into what was mentioned before, namely the fact that Answer has to defend against Slayer a lot, so Slayer can turn some of those attacks into actual just normal dashes and manage to get himself some space.
つでもおたけにどうもアンサーです。はい、先日ご挨拶のお伺いした。申し訳ございませんでした。それでですね、
ここだ。
はい、そのように。いい、構いません。はい、感謝いたします。
Depending on your character, throwing Slayer a lot is also very effective.
この一服より時間がかからん
A lot of Slayer's moves will basically fly right into the waiting arms of anyone attempting to throw him that is close enough to do so, making it more likely that he will want to stay away rather than close. Or at least that he will want to hit buttons instead of just defending at close range. Allowing the player to basically decide, do I want to fight Slayer from far or from close, depending on what I think my opponent's mindset is. And Slayer in turn has a lot of time to react to this and shift his situation accordingly as well. As you can see, since Answer's grounded super lacks the invincibility to get through most things, you can't even use it as a counter zoning tool.
Get up to rock! Get up to burn! Stand with the fire! Duel! Your desire!
Generally, at the range where one feels uncomfortable at Slayer's movement and does not know what to do, this is the range where, similar to Balrog, one must generally neutral jump. The amount of damage that you can get from this is usually extremely high. That feeling that your own buttons are not going to reach but you want to keep him out is the mental trigger for the neutral jump effect. He does not completely lack options at this range. In fact, he has quite a few good ones, but they don't go well with anything else he wants to do. Depending on your own character's aerial buttons, he may in fact have less options than you'd expect. For example, in Sin's case, as shown before, he has a diagonal directly down attack that actually will knock Slayer down entirely, leading to some really bad situations for Slayer when he's not actually getting the pressure on actively. Since many of Slayer's lows just flatly don't work on people who are airborne at all, it's easy to hold him out this way. When he starts going into the air, as a general response to this situation, it's much easier to anti-air him and deal with a lot of the things he can do. Because again, he does not have a whole lot of really good air options. They're relatively linear compared to most things. This also allows you to spend some time controlling the space, since if Slayer is on the defense end a little bit less likely to come in at you, it's much easier to backdash or even walk back to find your correct spacing, since he cannot afford to just do lows in order to make sure you cannot do that. However, for the most part, it's better to just neutral jump most of the time. because it removes the capacity for Slayer to change his own position with buttons, which is what he's normally using most of the time to save himself. He knows that he can use that, for example, to change the space while still not making you willing to move out of your position because it looks like you're being attacked. Until you've learned all of Slayer's spacings very particularly, your best option is just to get into the air and stay there when you have that situation. For characters who do not have as good air options, it's often not as scary for other reasons. You often have either a zoning tool that will actually stop a lot of his stuff, even his dashes, or ways to do invincible attacks on the ground to save yourself. The other thing that Standing Dust allows is for Sin to eat basically whenever he wants. The only way for Kai to get back in time is to air dash. In many cases, this results in Sin being able to eat and still pull off some move that results in Kai not being able to hit him at the very least. Though it does not usually lead to a situation in which Sin can safely anti-air. This is fairly dependent on where they were on the screen at the time it happened. Of the three functionally useful styles of Baiken, Kai only really needs two responses to them. Since Baiken's basic defenses don't stand up well to Kai's neutral jump, he only really worries about the offensive style. But Baiken's jumping attacks are not that strong, allowing him to keep a lot of space in both the anti-air game and avoiding her on the ground. Kai can then choose between running away when he has setups and staying at poking range, where Baiken really has to rely a lot on the range of her own standing dust and crouch heavy, I believe it's crouch heavy, to save her from Kai's normals. As both of these moves are not necessarily reactable but easily guarded, it becomes difficult for Baiken to do much without using a lot of her meter on Roman cancels. That said, generally, Kai does not have a good reason in this matchup to use too many of his fireballs because Baiken will move around them in ways that are problematic for him. And that frees her up to use hers at spaces where Kai would otherwise be invulnerable to most characters. When Baiken is sure that Kai is about to make a defensive maneuver, she can do a lot of related things and make him have to pay attention to where he is on the screen afterwards. She may not ever do any damage, but she does get herself some free spacing. From the Baiken player's side, therefore, the choice is, do I try to move away from Kai when he's in that space, or do I try to move toward him? Moving forward into Kai with Baiken relies on the idea that Kai will try to interrupt your movement. If Kai has no intention of interrupting your movement and will simply backdash out of everything, then there's no real reason to actually close in on him at all. It's much easier for Baiken to just backdash herself or give Kai that space so that she can set up the spacing she likes. It is also easier for Baiken to handle spacings than Kai, because she has a lot more options, and many of them are not truly reactable by most Kai players at this level. However, Slayer suffers in this matchup simply because Baiken's jump back air options are so incredibly good against nearly everything he can do. She defends herself well in the air to begin with, and also tends to space herself at the end of her own strings at a place where she can simply jump back. Since her 5D is also relatively long, Slayer is not often in a position where he can get away from her by waiting for her to move. While it might be reactable in the strict sense, there are too many downsides to being close to Baiken in this matchup. The Baiken player in turn has to figure out how to deal with when Slayer starts dashing, and at exactly what range they want to do particular things. Since she has such a relatively high execution curve for things she needs to do in neutral relative to Slayer's stuff, and many times, as you've just seen demonstrated, it will not result in Baiken actually dealing any damage to him. This also gives Slayer a very large advantage in terms of meter for most parts of this match. Baiken must therefore use her meter sparingly, and rather than going for the Roman cancel, since Slayer doesn't really care one way or the other, She can go into strings which allow her to use her blitz at moments when Slayer might otherwise have wanted to attack. Since the similarity between it and some of her other options tends to put him in a bad situation. This is one of the few matchups where Viken is in a better state altogether by using blitz rather than her counter moves. This is generally because Slayer's response to Viken moving at him should generally be automatically to hit buttons. If he sees her move normally, that's the easiest way to handle it. While she does have options and counters, a lot of them miss when he's actually attacking or dashing. Viken's weakness in this matchup is the generality of her spacing and the ease with which Slayer can hit her with his overhead. Since most of Viken's moves that would get through this overhead are also reactable from Sin's side, she doesn't generally benefit from using anything in particular. Viken's strongest option against Sin is often just to walk forward. She's a relatively intimidating character when she's just walking because she can jump at nearly any time, and due to the way her moves work and the way she tends to hang in the air, let's call it gravity control for the time being. She has a strong capacity to stop Sin from doing certain things. Sin in turn generally will want to do his own move, but if all Viken does is walk forward, he really can't afford to just go straight for the overhead. She will eventually just walk and get in without there being any stress. However, this requires a lot of patience because it's functionally forcing Viken to walk Sin down entirely. She cannot really make too many attacks or she will just get hurt. This also means that you must get a lot of execution practice in where exactly to space yourself after a knockdown with Viken, so that you can continue to be frustrating by walking forward. As jumping towards Sin or general wake-up pressure doesn't tend to work all that well from her. She has to spend a lot of time getting through that. Her other main option, once she has built up enough meter by doing this, is that she does have a nearly full screen super. One that tends to counter hit a lot of things Sin does, and while not functionally invincible, can whiff punish many of his moves, to the point where she will end up doing probably 20 to 25% of his health and damage just by having enough meter to do it. Walking forward, therefore, is a safe way to build up this meter while in that matchup. There you see Viken's other really good option. But it's really more so about whether or not Kai is going to move in or not. Baiken has two moves that hit low from very far away, and the question is simply, do I want to be closer to Kai or not? When Kai is playing defensive in terms of motion, generally one does not want to actually get in closer. As one gets higher and higher into the levels of this game, Baiken suffers more and more in this matchup in terms of being in the air, as Kai players gain higher and higher capacities for keeping her there without taking any damage themselves. However, her very good, almost superhuman jump, combined with the fact that once you start to do those things, you tend to leave yourself open for a lot of her counters and similar movements. Combined with aerial tatami mat attacks, generally mean that Baiken reaches a spacing where she can just hit a button and then instantly counter Kai's poke, because she knows he will not risk going to the air. Therefore, the execution curve goes up on both sides at about the same rate. Kai must get increasingly better at quickly executing moves to stop Baiken's air approaches, and Baiken must continually get better at doing counters or tricks to continue her own ground pressure when she has managed to slip through but has been blocked.
Get up to rock! Get up to bounce! Damn it, dude! Whoa!
Similarly to Xin, Baiken must often go straight into the air when she finds herself at a range where she feels as if she cannot hit Slayer otherwise. This is especially true when it is as a result of them being in a scramble. Unfortunately for her, between the tatami mat and her standard jump back attacks, there really isn't much need to spend too much time waiting for Slayer to attack. He does not do a very good job of punishing her aerial stuff. Particularly the tatami mat, he will generally just go straight through. As you can see demonstrated there, once Sin has managed to push Baiken out and has put any effort into keeping her there, she benefits on 2 levels from then attempting to use her counter to get in. Even if she takes some damage, Sin has normally not got any timing at which she can still get any food. So, Baiken can sacrifice some health to make sure that Sin has insufficient time for eating and then dominate the match from there. Similarly, her air float at that point and the ability to go under Beat Driver finishes out the approach to the matchup at the base level. Unfortunately, Baiken's Claw is very little use in this matchup against defensive Sin because he will normally either evade it while hitting her, or it will place him at a spacing where he actually has advantage when he blocks it. The generally longer delay between Sin's moves and control that Baiken has over certain things means that after his Beat Driver or overhead, he really does not get to do anything against her counter except wait on it. Once again, the execution therefore goes up, but Baiken's effectiveness goes up with it. It is not a matter of needing to execute a particular thing in order to survive, but rather to match the opponent's increase in execution. Because of the relative linearity of Baiken's counter-style attacks, however, this approach of Kai of generally backdashing is safe for many reasons. It allows him more freedom to go into the air and keep her out with his fireballs, and forces her to run into his normals quite a lot. Therefore, rather than putting herself in a situation where she can be hit by his stuff, it is easier to use her crouching attack, particularly the one that does not move her forward. It functions as a simple poke that prevents Kai from taking certain actions, while not putting Baiken into his attack zone. It also recovers faster, obviously, allowing her to jump earlier or to begin another move earlier, which is a highly important part of this matchup for her. The quicker Baiken can get back to motion when Kai moves out of the way or defends, the higher the chance that she will land some sort of aerial mix-up. As you can see there, she misses, but missing does not matter if the opponent is now nervous because you are going to recover before they will. Particularly when that move is blocked, Kai is forced into the situation you just saw. He wants to take an action, but Baiken recovers too quickly for the action to be a good idea. While this does not necessarily open up a lot for her, it can sometimes let her follow that crouching with the other one that does move her forward, as she has then optimized the space to use the second move. If the opponent continually tries to respond to that, she has most of her options at that point, and can therefore do a lot more things.
Get on to rock! Get up to burn! Stand with the
き様を見れば人は嘆く倒れるのだ。しかし私にとってはそれも美しき輝きの一つ。
So we're coming around to the last round of matches for the night. As always, stop by on Thursday for Kame House Lobbies in DDFC. And for various content related to Street Fighter V on Wednesday and Friday. That's that 30% damage. So this week has been mostly answer with some general Baiken and scene information for you. Next week we may see Ino again, possibly Chip. If you have any characters that you wish to show off and help with, feel free to join us. As always, it is an East Coast lobby, and the information you need is in the title of the stream. This has been 2MK with Rillian on the mic. Good night, everyone.